I'm Timandra Harkness. I'm chairing this meeting. I'm not much of a statistician, but I'm a decent chair and I'm a member here, so here I am. I am also very interested in this particular topic. Those of you who have access to Significance magazine could go back and read an interview I did with philosopher Jennifer Saul, who was working with the OSR on the question of misleadingness. I thank you all for braving the tube strike to get here. I hope nobody had too arduous a journey, or if you did, it makes a good story afterwards. I have to warn you that we are recording, we're not live streaming to the internet, but we are recording this event in audio and video, although the video is behind you, so you're probably safe if you're here in disguise. Should you actually really need to not be in the recording and but still want to ask a question, either write it down and pass it to somebody else to ask, or just have a quick word afterwards and say, please edit me out. I haven't been told that's possible, but I don't see why it wouldn't be. Anyway, but hopefully we're here in public, so a public discussion, and so none of this will arise. So Ed Humphrey, who's not here yet, will be speaking. He's from the Office of Statistical Regulation, so they've been doing a lot of work on misleadingness and why it's something to be deplored in statistics and how we avoid it. So our other speakers are Paul Kiff, who's Director of the Research Advice Service, which he describes as a service that people can come to and he can tell them whether the research that they're being shown is reliable and trustworthy. Then we have Anna Powell-Smith, who's Director of the Centre for Public Data, and Michael Blastland, writer, broadcaster, most recently co-chair of the BBC Fiscal Policy Impartiality Review, which I think is a much more exciting read than I've just made it sound. But also author and co-author of a lot of books very accessible books about statistics. So what we've asked them all to do is prepare a very short introduction to the topic so that we can maximise discussion time that all of you can be part of. And please don't spend time trying to tortuously turn a point you'd like to make into a question, because this is discussion. It's not, I mean, obviously feel free to ask questions, but you know, if you have an opinion, we want that. So don't let's pretend that everything's a question. So Paul, in Ed's absence, can I ask you to give us your 5 to 10 minutes of thoughts? You're most welcome to speak from there. I think the microphone will pick you up, or to use the whatever
you prefer. If you can't hear me, just wave your hand, okay? Yeah. Apart from my business interest in appraising research quality, I have a long history of teaching and carrying out research. I'm currently a member of NHS Research Ethics Committee. I'm also a volunteer for the RSS on their Statistics in Society pro bono scheme. And I was an original member of the RSS advisory group set up when the OSR was first established many years ago. What I have seen, the reason I set up the consultancy was quite a huge degree of difficulty that many researchers have with creating statistics, creating data that is capable of being reliable, and even more or even less reliable, should I say, in the way they go about analysing the data that has been collected. And I have witnessed some fairly prominent individuals, I'm not going to name names today to anybody, getting awards from the government, from the Queen, from the RSS. I've even seen examples in the pro bono scheme run by the Society of really poor practice. So I just know that whatever statistics may be being produced, you cannot trust, in my opinion. What I have also witnessed is other statisticians seeing similar defects, and if they open their mouth, they often get marginalised, victimised, forced to leave jobs. because they will upset someone who's either made a commitment based upon poor data or poor statistics or both. So I don't want to go into all the many types of example I could give. There are so many, I wouldn't know where to start or finish. So that's my starting point for being here, because I was asked my thoughts about the difficulties that data scientists had in dealing with NHS research ethics committees. It being implied that somehow the ethics committees didn't really understand what the data scientists were trying to do because they were out of touch. And I was quite upset with that because I don't think I'm out of touch. And I've seen several examples of so-called data scientists using things to create algorithms for displacing clinical judgment in medical procedures. And I think if I had been a victim of some of those algorithms, it's a 50-50 chance whether I'd still be here or not. So I think it's a massive problem because we keep hearing about algorithms being the future, displacing human judgment. That's fine if they are soundly based. But unfortunately, I have seen many examples where they are not. And it is not easy to detect which are sound and which are not. Okay, so that's where I start.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Paul. Ed, as you see, has arrived. So your slides are all set up.
I'm going to talk about how we approach the issue of misleadingness, how we think about misleading uses of statistics. And just to follow on from the remarks that we've just heard, there are lots of things which are potentially problematic about statistics. There are problems with how they're produced, how they're collected, how they're compiled, how they're presented, and also with their accessibility. And I don't want to downplay any of those things, but I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about use, and particularly use in the political context. So the themes of what I'm going to say, the main theme is that we at the Office for Statistics Regulation, we're learning about this all the time. I'm going to outline how we currently think about it, but it's evolving, and in fact one of the reasons to be here today is to get input from you as to whether we're thinking about this from the right perspective or whether we're limited in our thinking. Three other themes. It's a key part of what we do, and I'll explain that in a second. Furthermore, I think the issue really benefits from not just a statistical perspective, but a philosopher's perspective. And finally, I do think misleadingness is best explored through case examples. I have some case examples. I may not in my 10 minutes have time to go through them, but we can maybe bring them out in discussion, which we can get onto. So who we are is with the Office for Statistics Regulation. I think most of you are familiar with this, but just in case some of you aren't, with the UKSA's regulatory arm, and we promote and safeguard the production of official statistics. We don't produce statistics ourselves, of course. And our role, we think of as having three components. How statistics are produced, that's all the things I already mentioned in terms of quality and accessibility and so on. At the bottom there, that bottom block, we do a little bit of work on how statistics are valued and sort of public value of statistics. Today, I want to talk about how statistics are used in public debate. And the particular scenario here is in public discourse, a particular statistics is being used to advance a case. That's the classic scenario of use that I'm focusing on. Now, our assumptions about the use of statistics are really important. Firstly, how statistics are used affects public confidence in them. So the public hearing a politician make a case, drawing on numbers, can affect how that member of the public or groups of public audiences think about statistics more generally. Poor use can be corrosive of public confidence. Secondly, second assumption is lots of people write to me, raise concerns with me and with my organisation about what they perceive as misleading uses of statistics. A common thing which comes into my post bag, my metaphorical post bag, is, dear OSR, I've seen this, I think this is an outrageous and misleading use of statistics. So people really care about it. And the third assumption is it's important not for us to not act in a way which inhibits the use of statistics in public debate. So we're not about saying every time a statistics appears in somebody's argument, it should be it should be challenged or questioned, because that would sort of create an environment of inhibition, and that would not be healthy. And we want statistics to be used. That's a good thing. So putting those three things together, we need an approach to this question of misleadingness that is clear, but it's also balanced and proportionate, that it allows for the use of statistics to make political arguments, partisan arguments, that's okay as long as it's done in an appropriate way. So how do we get to a definition? About 4 years ago, one summer I was thinking, I'm really troubled by this issue of misleadingness. People are always writing to us about it. What does it mean? And questions which are, what does it mean, usually are helped by a philosophical perspective. So I literally Googled a philosopher who writes about misleadingness and discovered there was one, Jennifer Saul from the University of Sheffield. There she is, tremendous thinker. I got in contact with her out of the blue, said, you don't know me, but I love your work and all that sort of stuff. And I flattered her enough that she actually gave us some time. And we spent 3 or 4 seminars with her saying, well, we think it might be this. And she said, no, it's not that, in the way that philosophers do very, very helpfully. And it culminated in the paper that I've shown there. Our second, we had 2 papers. This was the second one on misleadingness, really strengthened by the input of her and her colleagues. We also explored it with like-minded organisations. I've got a couple of logos there. Quickly skip over that. In those discussions, we explored 3 potential approaches to what misleading use of statistics could mean. The first is a materiality and intention approach. In other words, focus on the intentions of the speaker. Is this speaker intending to mislead? That's one potential approach. The second potential approach is the other end of the telescope, so to speak, which is the audience. Is there evidence that the audience has been misled about what the statistics are saying? That's the second approach. And the third approach is to be attempt to be more objective and not think about what's going on in the mind of the speaker or the mind of the hearer, but say certain things, when they happen, we'd always consider to be misleading. A classic example of that would be a truncated axis. That would be a case-based. You'd say every time there's a case of a truncated axis, without further thought, that would be taken to be misleading. Now, I won't go through the full kind of blow-by-blow account of this, but with input from Jenny and some other philosophers she introduced her to, we decided to blend approaches 2 and 3, an audience-based approach and a case-based approach. And in particular, the philosophers were absolutely clear that an intention-based approach would get you nowhere, because to adopt an intention-based approach, what you'd have to do is form moral judgments about the intentions of speakers, and that would both be very tricky in our role, but also extremely difficult to sustain in an argument. So mixing 2 and 3 into, and this is the key slide, into this definition, which I'll just read out because it's quite involved. We consider a use to be misleading when, on a question of significant public interest, the way statistics are used is likely to leave audiences believing something which the relevant statistical evidence would not support. So that's where we arrived at, and that's kind of what we use on a day-to-day basis. Let me just decompose this. We use the word consider there because it's clear that we're forming a judgment. It is a judgment, not an absolute cast iron statement of truth that we're deploying. We are forming a judgment, so we consider. Secondly, it has to be about use, and it has to be in public debate. So this is not about the publication of statistics, it's got to be about how they're being used in an argument. A question of significant public interest, it's not just any use, it's got to be something where there's public debate, media debate, political debate. It's got to be something which is part of public discourse. We form a judgment on likelihood. The way statistics are used is likely to leave audiences believing something. So that is saying we're not going to go out and do audience testing every time we get a case. We are forming a judgment on likelihood. And that's quite important. We draw this actually from the Advertising Standards Authority. This was very much what they do, and we thought that was a good approach. Audiences, this came very much from the philosophers. They said you need to consider the relative expertise of the audience being communicated with. A specialist audience, you might have a bar for misleadingness in a higher place than a general audience. believing something, really crucial, its relationship of the statement to a belief about the broader world. So if the belief is unemployment is falling, that's a belief about the world. You know, it's about saying there's something going on out there and I'm using statistics to illustrate it. That's really crucial because it then sets up the final part of the definition, which is we would then look at the relationship between the belief, which is the attestation which is being made, unemployment is falling, with the full underlying statistical evidence. And is it being misrepresented? Now, I have cases. Have I time for my cases?
Can you give us one, and then maybe we'll come back for more if there's more time later?
Okay, I'll do one which probably be controversial, but I'll do my first one, which is was raised with us a question that the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, said that the number of people in poverty has fallen as a result of the actions the government has taken over the last several years. So a claim being made about the world that poverty is falling. And this MP, Bridget Phillipson, wrote to us and said, basically, this is misleading, that what Rishi Sunak had said was misleading. And to cut a long story short, we concluded that this was quite a legitimate thing for Rishi Sunak to say, that he was communicating a political perspective, a belief about the world, that his policies were the right policies or his government's policies were the right policies, and that it was not particularly misleading for him to draw from the statistical evidence information which would support his case. You could equally make the counter-argument, that would equally be legitimate, but we're not arbitrating between different political arguments. We are arbitrating between the uses, whether the statistics are being used in a misleading way. And our main artifact was looking at the poverty evidence from households below average income, which is the kind of crown jewels of low-income measures in the UK. And broadly speaking, when you encounter the full statistical evidence, which was this, we thought you would be hard pushed to say there was a dramatic piece of misleadingness going on. Now, I have two other examples where we concluded exactly the opposite, and we said this was absolutely misleading, so I don't want you all to think we're a soft touch, but I wanted to use one example you allowed me to say. We sometimes say, okay, well, people might disagree about this, but it's totally okay for somebody to have used statistics to support their argument. I think that's important if we do care about people actually using statistics in public discourse. I'll stop there.
And if we have time, we'll come back and get the bad arguments.
Yeah. Hi, if you can't hear me, please just wave. Thank you for having me. I'm not a statistician. I'm the director of the Centre for Public Data. We're a non-profit research and advocacy organisation working for stronger public data, especially data gaps. We set up in 2020. Before that, I had a small project called Missing Numbers, which was explicitly about data gaps, highlighting and researching them. My background is as a data scientist. I worked at the University of Oxford in the public health department and for a software company called Flourish to make data visualization software. The angle I would like to bring to this is actually, I know Ed excluded producers, but we're quite interested in producers, and in particular how the world of administrative data sets and databases, which are sort of changing everything, affects what producers can do, and therefore what we might consider to be misleading. So obviously producers can mislead, and there are lots of ways they could do that. You can simply make up data. That's extremely rare, of course. But there are some new ways, and data is changing that. And failing to catch up with that, failing to take advantage of the data that's available to you, we would argue can be a cause of misleadingness, because it can cause data gaps, and those are where people simply can't find the information that answers the questions they care about, even when the underlying data would make that possible. Sometimes there are data gaps because data is too hard to collect, it's just really, really expensive to collect, but those cases are less and less, and data is now, of course, cheap to aggregate and cheap to produce if it's held in any kind of database. So I'll give three examples of how I think these gaps can come about and some work we've done in each area. So the first is when producers of stats use surveys or samples rather than full data sets that are available to them. And we've done some work in the area of gambling. So the Gambling Commission publishes surveys. It surveys people for evidence of gambling harms, and it regularly says, evidence of gambling harms, levels are stable and fairly small. What they don't do is they don't very much ask gambling companies they regulate to give them hard evidence that might mean, that might show harms. So companies are asked to provide information on the number of customers and sort of total revenues, but evidence of harm, which could include a number of players who are producing a very high amount of revenue or long sprees of use at night, they aren't asked to provide that sort of thing. And all these companies, as we're saying, online gambling companies are data rich, they are data driven, everything they do is about data. So it's not difficult for them to provide that, and they will know perfectly well themselves. So we've been arguing that actually the regulator should be a bit tougher, it should ask for these sort of stats from its companies, and it should also publish its own stats on what percentage of revenues come from the top 10% of active customers, which would give an indication of roughly how many problematic players do you have, and it's quite feasible for the regulator to do that. I know that the OSR has, sometimes in the past, the Transport Focus survey, which asks people about how was your last journey on a train, intervened to say, actually, we don't think that's a good way of asking about people's experience of commuting as a whole. So I know that you have made interventions around that sort of use. So that's example one, surveys. Example two, this possibly blows producers and data managers a bit, but where you do have databases, if you set your database up so you're not recording important things from the beginning, that's possibly misleading too. So one example, we worked on the subsidy control bill, which was the government's post-Brexit reform of subsidies, so grants and loans to businesses. As part of this bill, we had to have a transparency database, recording where subsidies went and to whom and for what. This was being set up to record only subsidies over £500,000 on the grounds that recording them all would be too burdensome, and this was costed as an individual will have to type in each subsidy manually into the database, and this will be, it'll cost a few tens of thousands of pounds a year, so it's too expensive. So a few problems with this. One is, actually, of course, nobody types things manually anymore. It's very easy to, in practice they would have been submitted via an API backend. And two, it would have made the database fairly useless in terms of actually recording subsidies. It would have meant probably about half total spending wasn't recorded. And any subsequent stats would have been, much less useful. So we worked with the government's anti-corruption champion to try and get this changed, and we did successfully get the limit lowered. Third example, when you have admin data, not producing stats on the questions people actually care about. And this is unfortunately quite common, I think. So we've worked in a few areas in this. We're doing a research project at the moment about justice system data. We've been looking at where stakeholders like MPs, inspectorates, third sector organisations say we can't get the data we need. We're asking questions, we can't get the answers. And we've been looking also at the data the MOJ holds internally, and we're trying to produce recommendations around, look, here are things people are asking for, here's what you can do, can we meet in the middle? So we've highlighted things like legal representation in magistrates' courts. There's no stats on that, even though it's of quite significant public interest because legal aid cuts have meant representation has fallen. It's harder to get a lawyer. Number of people held in remand beyond the legal 6-month time limit, which is a real civil liberties issue because many of those people are innocent and they're being held beyond the time limits. There's no stats on that, for example, even though the MOJ does know that. So I'll stop there, but I think we'd perhaps just like to explore, is there room to expand the definition to producers, and also is there an element of misleadingness about not using data in ways you could use it, but choosing to do sort of more old-fashioned things instead. I'll stop there.
Lovely. I like that, the idea you mislead by not asking a question in the first place. Thank you very much. So, Michael,
Thank you.
what have you got to bring to this?
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to see this from Ed, and I'm delighted to see the emphasis in the paper on trustworthiness. It didn't figure heavily in the remarks, but taking a public perception of why there would be such an interest in the perception, as I understand it, is that from a public point of view, you want to feel that the evidence you're being presented with can be relied on, and that's a vital, public perception point of view. I think inevitably much of the concern is how to stop, as I think it was Jeremy Paxman put it, although more rudely, is how to stop those lying swine from lying to me. That's how to stop communication being misleading. But I want to take a slightly oblique approach to it. I wanted to talk about the broader context for what I think Ed is trying to do, the communication norms and culture that I think should apply. And the second, which is related, is to ask what would be the ideal. So not to do it from a negative point of view, how do we stop the bad, but what might the good, what might trustworthy look like? And what kind of communication culture would support it? And then if there's the time, I might mention the BBC and impartiality, although I'm not going to comment on Gary Lineker. Now, I don't have a master plan for this ideal, but I'd like to focus on one part of the question that's preoccupied the Winton Centre for much of its existence and is still preoccupying us now when we're closing down, and that's the difference between inform and persuade. So it's striking that Ed rejects the intentionality in misleading. You can't legislate for that, it's too difficult. And I think I agree with him, except that it is the guiding principle for me when I consume, or one of them when I consume statistics. So I'm going to try and make a case for it, for making this kind of distinction, even though I accept that producing a legal framework for it is very, very difficult. And it goes like this. The objection to, I think, is partly this, we can't define the difference between inform and persuade. But let's put it in a healthcare setting. Let's just try and think about inform, persuade in a healthcare setting. Is it okay for a doctor to put a thumb in the scale of the choice you face as a patient? Not to mislead you exactly, but to lead you towards the decision which they think, possibly you don't share this view, is in your interest. Maybe this is a surgeon, and we know that surgeons like doing surgery. They just do. And I'm a non-executive director in a specialist hospital, I know them. But maybe the evidence is a little equivocal, and maybe there are a few uncertainties, and they don't quite bring those uncertainties out. As one clinician said to us not long ago about some prognostic statistics that we've been looking at, we can't tell them that, they might decide not to go ahead. Maybe this is about screening. You get a scan when you're asymptomatic, but the leaflet inviting you to screening, as many leaflets were wont to do, and some still are, dismiss the risk of false positives. Is any of that trustworthy behaviour? I think it's not, and I think you might be able to catch it with some of the other targets Ed suggests, but I think really it falls down because you can feel that you're being lent on. You can feel an intention to drag you towards a particular conclusion. Maybe, as Ed says, you can get that by saying you're not representing the full body of statistical evidence here. But I think the answer is a trustworthy behaviour. It's emphatically not, in my view. Should we nevertheless be busting a gut to set an ethical norm in which it is mercilessly fought? I think we should. I think we should try and stop that kind of behaviour, and we should assert a better one. And the better one I have in mind is that you try and restrict that persuasive instinct. So what I'm trying to argue here is that it's not just misleading, but there's a fine boundary between that and leading. And if we're not strict about discouraging people from both and encouraging something where we simply try to present the fullness of the statistical evidence, then we're on a very slippery slope. And the presumption certainly in healthcare should be against leading patients. But then you say, if it's wrong in healthcare, why is it okay in science generally? Why is the interest of the public different in that case? Don't they also, in that case, want the true balance of evidence here in order to help all of us collectively make decisions? I don't see a fundamental difference really between the healthcare, between is this operation going to be good for me given my values, and receiving evidence which I can interpret in a way which serves my values again. In other words, is the information being presented in order to serve my interests, or in order to serve the interests of the person communicating it. And again, what I'm using there is a sense of intentionality, the thing that Ed doesn't like. I know why you don't like it, by the way. I accept a lot of that. So take a case in a public forum, COVID-19. I was reading a piece in an ethical journal the other day discussing COVID-19, and it said that too often interventions by scientists are often driven by a subconscious desire among scientists to shape rather than inform public policy. Partly this is a temptation to claim authority over policy questions that do not solely have scientific answers. So there's a blurring of empirical evidence with social or political preference. And COVID-19 is their case. I think with COVID-19 we've seen exactly what's wrong with a kind of intention to persuade. It can be aggressive, it can almost be litigious, we're still seeing people fighting over it. And in fact, quite a few of them will justify this and say that, no, that's exactly what you need to do in present, the culture of communication that we have. You have to fight for the science. You have to persuade. You have to exploit rhetorical devices like storytelling in order to sell your conclusions. Uncertainties are necessarily diminished because if people think you don't really know what's going on, you'll be less likely to be believed. This is the supposition. There is a common failure, I think, to convey the full balance of the argument, as Ed puts it, the full weight of the evidence. Statistics are often presented opportunistically. There's quite often a call to action of some kind. So the case is, associated with some kind of political platform. But if I say to scientists, could you just pull back a bit from all this rhetorical stuff towards an ethic which just informs, this ideal in the interests of the audience so they can make their own decisions? They say, oh, you can't do that, it's too difficult. The boundaries are too fuzzy. Of course I should be free to persuade if the evidence is compelling. And plus, the audience doesn't know what it's talking about anyway, so they should listen to me and not have their own views. It's always kind of slightly implied. Well, yes, the boundaries are fuzzy, but there's another line from another philosopher, Liam Kofi Bright, if I can find it, who says, the ideal will never be perfectly met is, after all, an argument that vice can always make against all virtue. And this is hardly considered the end of ethics. So I am in this respect an unashamed idealist, and I accept wholly that it's not a clean ideal. In practice things are messy, the distinction between inform and persuade is not perfect. But I think ideals are there for a reason, and I remain committed to this ideal, that from the public point of view, from a trustworthiness point of view, inform, for all its difficulties, is a far, far more trustworthy ethic than persuade. And it's on that basis that I consume quite a lot of statistics that I observe. And I do think we share a collective duty to try and sustain that as an ideal, because misleading will thrive more easily so long as we give leading such a free pass.
Thank you very much. So I think we should thank the panel for such a range of ideas. I'm very impressed here. Obviously, the role of a regulator is always particular in that you have to have a principle that can actually be applied in a way that both is and appears to be fair and practical and reasonable. But I like that we have also brought in a much wider sense of what misleadingness might be and why it might be a problem. The simple matter of people not understanding how they've arrived at the statistics that they're then invoking for whatever reason, even with the most generous interpretation, even not assuming any ill will. But the idea that you can mislead simply by omission, by deliberately not asking the questions that might give you inconvenient answers, or by asking questions in such a way that the inconvenient answers never emerge, or the idea that to lead is already to open the door to misleading, because in the same way I think this the same idea comes up when we talk about misinformation, which we can all agree is a terrible thing, but how to actually distinguish between information and misinformation, especially when opinions and narratives actually occupy most of that space, is a question that we have mostly at the moment failed to adequately address. And then all these things come back into the lap of people whose job it is to actually try and apply this idea, or is it? I mean, it maybe one of the things we should discuss, and I'm very much looking out at all of you, because I hope all of you have thoughts and that we'll hear many of them in the remaining 45 minutes. Is this something that we should throw back into the lap of the Office of Statistics Regulation and say, here you are, these are the rules, just go and apply them for us so we can forget about it? Or is this in fact a matter of a much wider field of practice and indeed culture, both within, if you like, the data and statistics and evidence community and then to the public more generally? So before I come out and ask you all what you think, I'd just like to give the panel a chance to come back and comment on each other's contributions, or even on what I have just proposed as a kind of characterisation of some of the questions. You went first, Paul. Is there anything, having heard everybody else, is there anything you'd like to come back on, either to add to what you initially said or to bring up some other points that you didn't have time to raise?
I think Michael would be very interested that the last research proposal I looked at a week ago was exactly one in which there was an experiment in giving patients information about the likely consequences of their next operation, whether this would affect their decision making. And the way the research was designed, it was very unclear whether it would actually produce beneficial outcomes for patients or for the medics. And that's the ethical issue that we raised as a committee. So it's happening. If we can persuade people not to go for expensive operations on the grounds that they're likely to suffer badly from it, that is a manipulative thing. So I think it's already happening.
Yeah, very much so, I think. Ed, do you want to come back on?
Well, the two speakers who followed me were both very, very sort of gracious in sort of conceding to me a degree of territory. And as I said, Ed's already covered use, but I want to talk about administrative data. And Michael, you were clear and respectful about the situation in which you want to operate. But I'd be gracious in return and say, actually, you've both made me think sort of new thoughts. One is, Anna, as you know, the things that you're alluding to, we do address. We just don't call it misleadingness. And I'm wondering actually whether we have adopted a notion of use, misleadingness, production, quality, that actually is probably not that helpful, and maybe we should not apply these terms in such a siloed way. So that's a really helpful contribution. Michael, you've got me thinking like big thoughts, I'm afraid, about what the ideal is and should be, and whether one could accuse us of giving away too much territory by allowing the space for politicians to be leading. That we say it's okay to be leading because that's your job as a politician, to make your case. We just don't want you to be misleading with respect to the statistics. And I think your challenge is maybe that is conceding too much terrain. So two really thoughtful interventions to help us.
Good, I'm going to send you away with homework.
Send me away with homework, exactly. yeah.
Anna. Sorry. Yeah.
When I make that argument, I'm very conscious of the fact that it would be a practical impossibility to try and stop politicians putting a spin on their own evidence. And you couldn't issue a judgment against every minister who stands up in Parliament and interprets data in a way which is favourable to their own political cause. You simply couldn't do that. But I think of this really as a kind of trying to establish a cultural norm in which I can better exercise my own judgments and other people can exercise their own judgments. So I do accept that, from a legislative point of view, I'm not being very helpful from a rule-setting point of view, but from a broader, what kind of culture do we, collectively, people who are interested in this, try and support? I think that's where I would come in.
That's helpful.
Is there not a problem, though, that, in a sense, if you are to leave any space at all for people to make an argument, express an opinion, especially in the field of politics, where essentially we look to politicians to give us competing or alternative visions of how we want the world to be. If they can never invoke factual evidence, whether statistical or not, in support of an argument about how the world ought to be, is that not in danger of getting rid of all dissent and argument and discussion?
No, I mean, I wouldn't stop them doing it, but I think my reaction is that I'm disinclined to believe them when they do. You know, so, I mean, fine, you know, say all this stuff, but, you know, if there's no uncertainty in here's our policy and it will sort this out by next year, we're going to be, you know, it's kind of, here's our target and we're going to reduce X by, but we're not going to talk about all the other things that it's going to make worse. You know, I mean, here's all the evidence that serves our cause, but I'm not going to present any of the evidence that doesn't. You know, I mean, this kind of well, fine if you want to do that. You know, but I think the job of a lot of the rest of us is to point out, you know, that this is a very, very partial reading of the evidence, and accordingly, we should place our, you know, withhold our trust, because their behaviour is not trustworthy. The trustworthy presentation of evidence is one that recognises uncertainties, which tries to offer some account of the arguments on either side. You know. Saying all this, of course, I'm aware that I'm making an argument. You know, I'm seeking to persuade you all of my position. But there's a point about that, which is that there are different places where that's more acceptable and some places where it's less acceptable. And I think in journals and science communication, for example, it's much less acceptable, and we're quite weak about policing it there. In politics, I just let them get on with it because I have such a low regard for political debate. You know, but that's maybe that's a loss which we shouldn't tolerate either, or not tolerate quite so easily.
So Anna, what have you heard that you'd like to come back on?
Well, I wanted to ask Ed, and pick up on the kind of intentionality point as well, about how you use the definition of misleadingness, because I had understood that your interventions policy does take into account intention to some extent, in that you're more likely to intervene if you thought somebody was deliberately saying something as part of pairs speech as opposed to off-the-cuff and PQs. Is that right?
Yeah, but that's not a... Intentionality in the context I was using it means we are not going into this saying, is this person intending to mislead?
Yeah.
We're not forming a judgment as to whether what they have said is a deliberate attempt to fool the public or guile. We're saying what you have said is not consistent with the underlying statistical evidence, and therefore it is having the effect of misleading or potentially misleading your audience. Mm-hmm. So we're not ascribing a moral attribute.
Yes.
So that's what we mean by intentionality.
Yeah.
We're not being a moral arbiter. We're being an arbiter of the relationship between a claim and the underlying statistical evidence. And I think to get into the moral arbiter space, it becomes, I mean, it's not just difficult because we're a public body and all of that. I think it's fraught with difficulty in general discourse around this. I mean, the people who write to us would love us to say, you're a frigging liar.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think that's...
You weren't here at the beginning when I said this was being recorded, were you?
I'm very happy to be recorded by saying
good.
that. That's fine.
But it might influence whether you actually make the intervention in the first place or not.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And how do you then use misleadingness? Does that determine the severity of your response, or?
Well, the case arises. We look at it. We say, is this an example of being misleading? So we form a view on that, or is it an example of another kind of problem? And as you will know, a very common thing that we will conclude is that something has been said for which no public information is available. So a classic example, which you brought to our attention, claims about modern slavery, the modern slavery arrangements being gamed by people who are not victims of modern slavery, but is trying to game the immigration system. We were very clear that that was fairly obviously a claim not supported by any evidence that we could see in any public format whatsoever. So we quite often will say, well, that's not really being misleading. That's just like, talking out of complete disregard for the evidence altogether.
Yeah.
So do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily, just because we conclude it's not misleading, conclude it's okay. We might say, actually, the problem is something else altogether. And another point we quite often will conclude is, actually, the problem isn't with what the politician is saying, it's with the production of statistics, where the production of statistics has allowed unclear interpretations to flourish. And that's a problem the ONS should, or whoever it is, might need to fix. So, yeah, just because it's not misleading doesn't mean to say it's okay.
I mean, that does bring us back to kind of the argument you were making, which is that you can communicate statistical evidence in a way that is not in the communication misleading, but because when you go back a stage, either the data was not collected, or it was collected in a form that was going to bias, or if you like, lead towards a certain result, then that actually in itself can be misleading. So I suppose what I want to ask you is that something that you feel is amenable to intervention by other bodies, whether it's the OSR or professional bodies or public bodies or whatever, to say, well, you know, this result isn't false, but it is misleading because of these points further back. Is that a useful framework? A more useful perhaps than trying to come up with some kind of objective measure of quality of what information is collected and when and how?
Yeah, I think it is a useful intervention. I mean, the OSR has the code of practice, and part of the code of practice is value, so stats should meet public goods around value and relevance and so on. And I think if stats aren't providing that, answering the questions people care about, then there's a role for the OSR, hopefully, I know you do, say that they're not meeting their relevance. The question of not recording things in the first place is a bit more tricky, and I don't think it's something that the stat system would necessarily concern itself with at the moment, but I think other bodies, possibly like the NAO, might be wanting to look at that and maybe have more of a role around saying, if we're going to assess value for money 5 years down the line, value for money actually does include delivering things you said you were going to do as well as spending it. We could perhaps intervene more actively around saying, are you measuring things we're going to try and look at in 5 years' time?
And if not, why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I try an example?
Yes.
Because I know you like case studies. So, this is BBC. So Andrew Dillman and I spent a long time looking at BBC's output on mostly economic questions to do with tax spend, borrowing, debt. And there was one graph used by the BBC which showed the growth of the UK's national debt. And it just went whoosh. And it started in about the turn of the millennium, and it went up to about 2022, whatever it was, the latest data. And there was nothing factually incorrect about this graph. And it sourced from the ONS, and it was sourced from the ONS. Nothing wrong with it at all. And we judged it to be highly misleading. And the way that in which it was misleading was the framing of that data. One, you couldn't immediately tell whether it was adjusted for inflation, for example. And it wasn't. More importantly, economists don't tend to use measures of debt which are just pounds. They tended to compare it to the national income. Why do they do that? Well, because you do the same thing. You'd say if your debts are £100 and your income is £100, you're in trouble, annual income. If you're Elon Musk, debts of £100 are insignificant. You compare it to your income. And national debt, we do the same thing. BBC didn't present the data in that way. Oh, why did it do that? Because it was using, I think, or the journalists concerned were using a very instinctive, homely understanding that all debt is bad. You wouldn't want to be indebted, so why would the nation? And they were taking a bunch of figures and saying that therefore debt for the nation is bad, and looking at this rising line and saying therefore that's terrible. Well, there is a substantial body of economic argument that says the current debt position is nothing like as bad as a lot of other people say it. The professor of economics at Oxford University takes that view, that we should chill a little about the national debt, and particularly did after 2008 when we had a similar, kind of we're all doomed, debt's going through the roof. Now, I'm not trying to weigh in on one side of the argument or another. I'm simply saying that you can be entirely well-sourced, you can be entirely factually correct, and as we all know, probably in this room, you can be completely misleading. I don't even think there was an intention in that case actually to mislead. I think the journalists concerned didn't understand the breadth of the argument out there, and so they resorted to some kind of intuitive feeling about what debt meant to them. But it was certainly misleading. And yet I think it probably would have satisfied quite a lot of our usual rules about what, unless, did it present the full weight of the evidence? I don't know.
Is that reasonable, though, to expect one graph to present an entire picture?
Well, you could present 2 graphs. There's plenty of room on the internet,
Okay, well, I see hands are starting to go up out in the audience. So let's take a couple of points from the audience before I let you lot pile back in. So I saw your hand first at the back, and then I'll come to you. I don't think you need a microphone, but just project.
Simon Briscoe.
Hi, Sam.
Something I've been itching to say, Michael, but you sort of given me the perfect example with your example. I'm no philosopher, and having been a trustee of full fact for some years, these are the sorts of arguments we wrestle with. And it's left me feeling that the only way that a government office can deal with this, so in a sense that piles the responsibility back onto Ed, is to ensure that sources are given and that the government machine publishes data fairly and that these numbers are easily findable. And I think the problem I would have with that example you gave is that I bet the BBC would have said the source was ONS, so that's one of a few million web pages where you'd never find it because it would be called something different on that page. There'd be no guide produced on the ONS or AXA website. So I've always felt, and I continually get on at Ed about this, that it's a shame that the producers can't be clear about it. It doesn't help with many of the other examples that have been given today, but I at least think with the critical figures, the national statistics, the essential fabric, social and economic fabric, it should be relatively easy to do. If I can just end with a question to Ed, really, and I'm always pleased when Ed writes letters to people who've complained about the use of government, but it also deeply saddens me in the way that full fact output deeply saddens me, because it can only be a minuscule fraction of the problems which are actually going on with misleading use of data. So I suppose the question to Ed is, instead of just responding to people who've written into him, having identified what they think is a problem, would it be good if the OSR was sufficiently funded to actually go and find the problems which I suspect are rather greater than those in general that might have come to him through correspondence?
Okay, thank you very much. And can we get the microphone down to this gentleman at the front? Sorry to make you run around. Thank you.
Thank you. John Spain, former actuary. A question for Ed is the assessment of whether or not something is misleading a binary one, or do you have some sort of measure, a continuous measure in mind? I'll leave that on the side. Second thing is, okay, I'm going to quote from a sample of data that I have, and it's been peer-reviewed, and this particular sample has a mean of 75%, standard deviation of 5%, so that's pretty solid, and those are the numbers I'm going to quote, and that will help me, hopefully, to suggest, as opposed to persuade, the audience, in whichever form it is, that this is pretty good. What I have failed to do is talk about the second sample, which is similar in terms of coverage, but quite different. The mean is 40%, the standard deviation is 20%, and they're a similar number, and that might incline people, if they knew about this sample, to think, hang about, the guy's crazy, or the guy's lying to me. And I think it all comes back to context, certainly for the BBC example, and trying to make sure, as the gentleman at the back said, that data is not statistics as such on their own. It's statistics coming from the data sample or samples that are used, that the samples are revealed fully. And I don't think that happens very often, certainly not within the financial community in this country.
Thank you very much. Anybody else before I come back to the panel? Oh yeah, there, just behind you actually. Just behind you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Elise Baisley, Office for Statistics Regulation. I was really interested in what Anna said about the design of data in the first place, and as well as the other reflections, it kind of got me thinking, one of the problems here with judging misleadingness is the slight point-in-time aspect versus ongoing behaviour. And I know that might fall more in trustworthiness than misleadingness, but I was curious to the panel's views on kind of how much we should factor someone's use in isolation versus ongoing behaviour or choices. So in Anna's example of data, there's many cases where statistics and government are attached to service delivery, so universal credit. At the outset, that probably had good intention to just monitor everything you can possibly collect on universal credit. But as policy evolves, the interests evolve and the questions become more specific, and there are choices to be made about where you invest in getting those breakdowns. But then equally, a challenge back to you, Ed, on the poverty one. That one case, yes, it was factually true, but you will recall there were many cases of poverty statements over a period of time, which led the audience to a certain perception on poverty under this government. So how much is misleadingness? Should it be treated as isolated incidents or kind of continued behaviour? Thanks.
All very good questions. So I'm going to come back and let the panel chip back in, and then I will come back out for another round. And I think one of many things which has just emerged just from those 3 points is what we haven't explicitly touched on, which is it misleading if you communicate evidence without being explicit about a level of uncertainty that goes with that? And I know that's something you all have opinions on. So who'd like to come back in? Obviously, don't all feel obliged to answer everything, but it would be good if everybody gets an answer.
I want to make a general point related to your interjection. Statistics are not the answer to everything. Sometimes it's research. And you can get the answers to questions without wanting to set up massive data collection programs. Particularly because we've seen an absolute explosion of the concept of data science. Somehow throwing statistical techniques at mountains of data which exist, we're flooded with them, is going to give us an answer to a question. For that specific example you gave, it is not the best way to find out whether, what the actual situation is. There are many researchers who could find an answer to your question without just trying to address what data happens to be available in the public domain.
Thank you. Who'd like to come in next? Yeah, go on.
So, yes, in terms of the effects of UC, I agree, you need quality research, people going out and talking to users. The problem is when you have permanent secretaries saying on Twitter, there's no quantitative evidence it's causing any harm, because their own department doesn't produce any. So I think you need both. I certainly wouldn't argue you don't need equal evidence. So I just wanted to come back in on that one.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to?
On point in time versus ongoing, I'll let Ed comment on the sort of, I guess, more philosophical aspects of that. I think in terms of policy design, ideally what you do is at the beginning say, here are the important questions in the round we want to know about this policy, and we're going to try and implement them so we have answers to them. And with UC, the sort of, initially, I'm such a loser, I have read the kind of UC initial design documents. There were really robust plans to measure lots of the impacts and lots of the outcomes, and it seemed to just boil down and down and down into how many people can get onto it, how fast, and that was all that was being reported. So, yeah, I think you need a sort of clear commitment early on to here are the questions we're going to design around those questions. But I'll let it come back on things.
Maybe we need, I'd be the last person to say we need more civil service and more bureaucracy, but maybe maybe we should have a department of the civil service whose job it is to go into all new policy and say, right, well, what we want you to measure and record from the introduction of this policy onwards is these things. Yeah, so if somebody could make that happen, that'd be great. Ed, what would you like to add?
Can I just pick up on that last? I'm afraid I've got a lot to say, so I'll try and be succinct. That last point, you should look into the work of the Evaluation Task Force, which is a really brilliant. One of the things in the sort of the reform of public policy in the last 5 years, which I think is really genuinely very good, and it is taking on the noble endeavour of doing exactly what you describe, of not only doing that, but making it in line with what we would call trustworthiness, making it pre-committed, so that actually what is being evaluated will be set out up front, thereby denying the opportunity to departments to only publish the favourable results they want to publish. Now, that's a big mountain for them to climb, but they're doing it and they're having some success. So look into the work of the Evaluation Task Force.
I will do. Almost like pre-registering scientific studies so that you can't cherry-pick results.
Yeah, the really, really great thing, and more power to their arm.
Very good. Anyway, back to what you were going to say.
So what I was going to say was, I love the way in this conversation that when philosophy is coming up, people are pointing to me. That Ed can come in the office and was like, "I'm no philosopher." Came from Simon. I'm no philosopher. I've had a coffee with a philosopher. That gives me any ability to pass myself off as one. What I think was great from these comments was that you've outlined some things which I would say actually are pretty straightforwardly misleading. I think the example of the two sample selections, if I was presented with that, I would say that is misleading. To choose the one which is favourable and disregard the other, that is pretty straightforwardly in line with my definition is misleading. And the comment about something being ongoing, I think is exactly right too, that the one-off use and comment is much less corrosive to, the kind of ethical norms about communication that you're promoting. I think that's much less bad than an ongoing, repeated use of something. And I always, maybe I should have put this in my presentation, I always get worried when a particular number becomes this weaponized, sort of repeated hammer blow. Every time an argument comes up, this one number gets used. I think almost always in those cases, the number leaves its context and starts to become misused. And finally, on the point about poverty, this ongoing use becoming misleading, there's an excellent blog been written on exactly that point by the person who asked the question. So you should check that out.
What was your name again?
Elise, it's on the other side.
Okay, everybody go and read that. Michael, what would you like to come back on?
Just to mention a word about limitations of evidence, because it could be that there isn't another sample that has been neglected, but just to state in that sort of admirably humble way that we wish all public participants would do, the principal secretary, for example, saying, well, this is what we know, but we don't know this, and this would actually be material if we could find it out. So, the public acknowledgement of what this does not resolve, does not tell us, I think, I'm not sure if that falls foul of any of your rules, but I would say, if you don't acknowledge those limitations, then you could very easily mislead. And it's not because, you're ignoring any evidence. You're ignoring an absence of evidence, if you like. You're ignoring the don't knows. And defining those, I think, is quite difficult, of course. I will mention this very briefly. Just right at the beginning of COVID-19, Marcus Manalfo, George Davis-Smith and I wrote a piece for the BMJ saying, if only we could chill the debate and everybody would just admit what they don't know. Things would proceed in a much more civil, constructive manner. And out of that, we had a whole series of the known unknowns, they were called, these events which were run by the BMJ and Bristol University. 200 2,000 people, I think, for the initial one. There's an enormous willingness, I think, to accept that this kind of evidence matters, this kind of evidence of absence, evidence of lack of understanding, lack of completeness. I think people are quite receptive to that, and I think we should give it to them, and I think permanent secretaries should acknowledge it when they're presenting evidence. So limitations, I think, is a difficult one for your rules, but I think it's a key one.
Acknowledging limitations. Okay, I'm going to come back out. There were some more hands. Oh, lots of hands. Okay, right. I want to obviously get everybody in, and there's 5 hands up now. So let us just start on this side, and then we'll do these 3, and then come back to the front here, and then I will let the panel come back in to answer everything.
Thanks. Kevin McConway of various places. I'd like to draw an analogy. I mean, this is these thoughts were really brought into my head, I think, by what Michael was saying in his introduction. But I think it goes a bit wider than that. What I'm thinking of is what happened to all the economic theories of efficient markets, perfect markets, and things like that, which turned out not to describe what was going on. And the reason they didn't describe what was going on, I'm ridiculously oversimplifying here, is transaction costs in the wider sense. The cost of trading, the cost of setting up a new company, the cost of blah, 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 blah. If they were what meant that markets did not actually behave as the economist's simple model said they behaved, and you needed to think in a different way. And what I'm thinking about is the transaction costs are part of the context of economic activity, and I think there are important parts of the context here that need to be taken into account. So Michael said at one point, this is what I think should happen in a clinical encounter between a doctor and a patient, and I have a lot of sympathy with that. But then later on, he went on to say, well, why should it be different with other sciences? After all, there's some scientific experiment being done and there's some facts being known and so on. But the trouble is the communication situation, it seems to me, is completely different. So in a clinical encounter, there's the patient, there's the doctor. The patient can ask questions. The patient can say, well, what do we know about this? And the doctor can say, well, actually, we don't know anything. The doctor can put their thumb on the scale or not. It's a two-way system. With a lot of science, it's not a two-way system. The scientist says something. The scientist does not necessarily speak to the public or interested people or anything like that. It's filtered through science journalists, through commentators, through tweeters of various motivations and so on. And then another kind of context which is a bit different is that the sort of choices may be different. If we're talking about policy choices, we need to take into account the political process. So I may decide this is what I would like the corporation tax level to be because it would suit me, or this is what I think would be good for people like me or for the country as a whole and so on. But if there's not me saying that has got absolutely no power at all, I can tell my MP, nothing will happen. I can set a political party, but that's not going to do it. There is a limited number of choices, and therefore knowing what data to bring to bear on the basis of choices, none of which would suit me personally, is essentially impossible. And my worry is that unless we take these contextual things into account, we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, to be honest, in the clinical encounter, one thing which shows how difficult that is on its own, a good example of this is the TV program that Hannah Fry made about her cancer diagnosis, where she felt at the end that she had not asked the right questions, and she talked to other people who had been in similar encounters where what they were reporting they had heard was not what we had heard in the recording of what had been said. One is having to make a decision in that sort of circumstance linked to all sorts of emotional and other aspects where it's difficult to know what's going on, and our rationality is bounded. And so to talk about, well, here are all the things you need to know. This might be relevant, this is definitely relevant, this nobody knows anything about, and so on. Isn't that just a sort of counsel of perfection? And we may aim to go in that direction, but in practice, we're not going to get very far down the road in a lot of cases. Thanks.
There you are. Okay, a case of pragmatism to counterbalance your idealism. So can we get that microphone over to these 3 people here? I don't mind which order we hear them in, and then we'll come back to you on the front row.
Duncan Bradley, University of Manchester. I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on simplification, and that there's been some debate just this week about this Hans Rosling quote, where he says you've got to be like a tabloid newspaper out the front and the Academy of Sciences at the back. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on when it's appropriate, if ever, to simplify in order to make a point that you feel is justified by the evidence, but that you are presenting it in a way which paints a clearer picture for the purposes of communication.
Nicely going to the absolute centre of communication with that point, question, contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Elias, University of Warwick. There is a well-known trick that legal teams use when they are in a jury trial. In that prosecuting or defending, they will sometimes say something that's kind of bordering on illegality or the truth or whatever, and the judge will reprimand them and say, the jury is instructed to disregard those comments. But the jury's heard them. The cat's out of the bag. This is the problem that we have with the more reactive approach that the OSR is taking, which I applaud. I think it's marvellous that that's being done. But is there any possibility that this could be moved forward? And I think this is echoing what Simon was pointing out, such that there's more emphasis on telling people what something is when it's misleading, what misleadingness is. How do we understand it? How can we pick it out? We have things like the Nolan principles on public life, which everybody's kind of confronted with if they're in a public position nowadays. Should we have something that points out that misleadingness can be corrupting, it can be evil at times, it can just be a mistake, it can be an error. But is there a way in which we can move away from the reactive approach to something a little bit more proactive?
Marvellous, thank you. And gentleman next to you.
Rick Payne, University of Portsmouth. I wondered if there was any thought given to mapping out the system and taking on board what's been said earlier in probably particular contexts, so a medical context or a political context. And the things that are occurring to me, the links to statistical literacy, which I know RSS is doing a lot of work on, journalists who are pretty much there to try and find the slip or the slight element of doubt or uncertainty which becomes the headline, so that relationship between journalists and politicians. So how do we map out the entire system to start to think about how we address misleadingness?
I'm liking that we're ending with, I think it's a gentleman at the front row here.
If you want to answer those questions first,
well, I think I'm going to have to then come back to the panel to do all the summing up. So you get the last word from the floor, no pressure. So go for it.
Yes, so Nigel Marriott, independent statistical consultant. So Ed, this is a question mostly for Ed. I just want to read out the test that you put up on there, at least, when you consider the usage to be misleading, etc., and you laid out tests. So my first question is that test now live? Are you actually using that in practice? Secondly, is that test only for public sector bodies, or does it also apply to charity and private sector? Now, I have a particular case in mind that in my professional field, which I'm very active in, that test has been met. To my mind, no question it's been met. I have a charity I want to make a complaint again, and a private sector body I want to make a complaint again. So how do I make that complaint then, if you are going to enforce it against private sector and charity? If you're not going to enforce it, do you have plans to do so, etc.? If I can make that complaint against them, how do I go about it? What's your capacity and timeline for dealing that? And if you upheld my complaint, what's your remedies and power do you have to make sure they're not doing it again?
Well, I like this because we have both the immense how can we reorder the world to make it less misleading, and the very practical and specific. So I think this is a great note on which to ask the four of you to. You have a few minutes. I think I'm going to, because we started 5 minutes late, I'm going to overrun by 5 minutes by that clock, which is a little fast. So don't rush, but obviously try and be concise. And I'm going to take you actually in reverse order of the way you should have spoken, which means that we'll be ending with you, Ed. So you might be able to squeak in another example, which means starting with you, Michael. So again, I mean, I think it would be great if everybody's point could at least be acknowledged or addressed, but you don't all have to answer everything.
Okay, I'll have a go. Some of them anyway. Kevin's doubt about perfectionism being a sort of counsel of unreasonableness. I think the professor protests a bit too much, actually. I think my difficulty is, I mean, I can fully concede the perfectionism in the sort of ideal that I've tried to describe. I think it's really that observing that too much, for example, of the academy decides, oh, we won't even bother then. You know, and so this is why I describe it as a norm. You know, it's a cultural norm, it's an aspiration, which we could at least reach for, rather than saying, this is too difficult, let's just let anything go. You know, say, oh, so I was a little bit selective. Well, you've got to in this game, haven't you? You know, you don't get grants in this game unless you puff the thing, hype the thing a little bit. That's how it all works. I mean, I think when we allow those kind of apologetics to dictate the way that we present evidence, we're in real trouble. So do we push up the hill or do we push down the hill? I think we push up the hill. You know, that's the aspiration. And I agree, probably at the extreme, it's not achievable, but I think that's the aspiration. That's the right one. The Hans Rosling simplify. I caught a bit of that. I think it's very. It's a really difficult one, I think. And Hans Rosling was the great simplifier, and he was tremendously effective. With these 7 bricks for the distribution of global income. And there it all is in 30 seconds, and all the way through. I think there's almost a grammar, isn't there, of these things, that you recognise the context in which somebody is speaking and behaving, and you say, okay, in this context, I sort of allow that, but let's recognise that this is as much about sales, and we discount it accordingly, and then let's go away and scratch at the data to understand it more thoroughly. I can't argue against all polemical uses of data. You just can't do that, can you? I mean, it'd be a very dull world apart from anything else. But I think recognising the context in which he was speaking is probably the right way to think about what he's doing. I don't think it's a general rubric for all communication, what he was offering. I'd be very nervous about that. Those are the only two I feel I have anything to respond with.
Okay, lovely, thanks. Anna.
Thank you. On the interested in the point about simplification, I mean, for me that picks up on what an earlier audience member asked about sourcing. So as long as you're always sourcing everything rigorously, to communicate you have to simplify, but you should always be sourcing as much as you can. And actually the misleadingness definition might be very useful, because it might tell you, is your simplified communication substantially misleading the audience? Yes or no? I just wanted to throw something into the mix which kind of relates to some of these questions, which is I really recommend everybody go and have a look at a thing called Census GPT, which is people using ChatGPT to provide a natural language interface to the US Census. So you can ask questions like, which US neighbourhood has the highest proportion of high-income people or whatever, and it will very quickly and very accurately translate that into an SQL query, run it across the data and give you an answer. And it actually changes, I think, a lot of what's possible in statistical communication and how we might think about some of this stuff. So sorry, slightly tangential way to end, but it's very exciting.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul.
I was reminded of a book, I can't remember the name of the author, called The Perils of Perception.
Yeah.
But in fact, we all believe things to be true. And whatever evidence may be presented to us, if it doesn't agree with our perception, it very rarely shifts our perception. And another thought is that most people in the public believe that there is the knowledge about everything we need to know is there. That we must know the answers to all these questions, when quite often we don't. And it's quite often the problem that politicians won't accept, admitting that I don't know is the only true answer. There seems to be a fear of admitting lack of knowledge, and it would help if people would sometimes say, I've no idea. It should not be seen as a badge of dishonour.
Very good point. And I think, it links back to research done at the Winton Centre into whether communicating uncertainty eroded trust in the source of the information. And I believe you found that on the whole it didn't.
Well, there are two aspects. Does it erode the sense of the trustworthiness of the message and of the messenger? And in neither case did we find that it did. You want to try that in lots of different contexts. But no, we didn't find on the whole that acknowledgement of uncertainty was a disadvantage to the communicator.
So Ed, you get the last word. And if you want to slide in one of your examples, if you feel you have time for that, then go for that.
I think
but if not, then...
I think I don't, because actually I have a reasonable amount to pick up. One big point and then pick up two other things which have come up in the conversation. The big point that I'm reflecting on is the role of heuristics, simplifications which help us make sense of the world. Actually, our definition of misleadingness is an heuristic. In fact, making these judgments, each of them could be, a doctoral dissertation in its own right. We have to adopt a definition which enables us to respond. This is going to sound a bit facile, but people write to me and they really are worked up about something. And I feel a responsibility is to treat a bit like you said with your concern, treat their things with care and a bit of respect. And I think, taking 3 years to answer it, you need a heuristic to help make some sort of progress with that. Now, like all heuristics, it's limited, and limited in the ways that many of you have pointed out. But I think I would still defend to the hilt that in doing a public role here, which I think is publicly valuable, it's useful to have something which gives you a way to make progress with reasonable speed. Second point about heuristics, though, is that actually it's run through lots of the questions we've just had. I think, Kevin, your point about transaction costs led me to think that, in fact, some of the ways in which the leading communication statistics emerges is to cut down on the transaction costs, which would otherwise arise if full evidence was disclosed in full ways to a fully knowledgeable and participating audience. You reduce the transaction costs by creating heuristics, which might be a nice graph which allows the surgeon to say, here's where I might think. And of course, by creating a heuristic, you create all sorts of, by reducing your transaction cost in that way, you create all sorts of opportunities for misleadingness or manipulation in the way that you've described. But I think probably you have to weigh that against the massive costs of, like, if you do it in the perfect way, the transaction costs are so high, it'll probably be barriers to entry to most people. So I really like that economic lens on it. The point about Hans Rosling and the point about the legal trick both made me think about this, that what we need is to recognise the value of simplification. Again, heuristics, simplify things to enable them to be understanding, but have principles which enable us to identify those cases when it's bad simplification and those cases when it's good, helpful simplification, because otherwise we end up in a world of where the communication of information becomes overwhelming. So I think we need to do that, and I think the Peter Elias point of sort of Nolan principles, I think, would be heuristics. And I'm a believer in not worrying about the statistical literacy of the population in the sense that people can't calculate a compound interest rate. I think that's a bit of technocratic arrogance on the part of people who do know those things. I think much better to say, can we equip people with critical thinking skills which enable them to interrogate things intelligently? So it's not a sort of technical skill, do you know how to do this? It's more, when you're confronted with this, do you know how to approach it in a way with an appropriate degree of skepticism? All about heuristics. So that's my first thing. I think a really useful tour of the upsides and downsides of creating simplifying logics to help you make sense of things. Second point, a Nigel, your point about the charity sector. So the definition is live. We don't have a formal remit over the charity sector. Some charities voluntarily sign up to our code of practice, and when they do that, part of the deal about doing that is that they open themselves up to if one of their users has a concern that we would pick it up. But actually, if there's something which is big in public discourse that comes from a charity, we would be willing to comment on it on a kind of advisory basis. We'd say, we don't have any formal remit here, but applying our principles to this case, this is what we think. So maybe there's a conversation to be had that we would be willing to do that, because, to come back to Michael yet again, we believe in this ethical norm of appropriate communication. So if that's being undermined by actors who are not government bodies, it just poisons the well for everyone, right? So we feel it's appropriate for us to reinforce our principles, but without the same degree of force that we would do if it was a government body. So we can have a conversation about that. That's the second point. Third point, I realised I didn't respond to the suggestion earlier that OSR should be much bigger. I'm really delighted with that, and I would take that offer, but I would split the budget 50-50 with the evaluation task force if I got that budget increase, because they do great work.
Marvellous. So before I ask you to thank the panel, I'm also going to fold in a little more thanks. Thanks to everyone here at the RSS who has organised and put on this meeting, including, but not exclusively, Teresa, who's been doing the AV and running around and the recording, and of course, sadly not here today, although this is really very much his baby and he's put in a lot of work on this, Tom King. So please include him in your thanks, and thank the panel for a really interesting discussion, and thank all of you as well.